In this podcast, I'm sharing my passion and curiosity for soft robotics, where we share inspiring stories about the work we do and how we can push the limit. I am Mara Dwayne, and this is Soft Robotics Podcast. Support for this show comes from Science Robotics Journal. I really find Science Robotics to be a great resource for reliable and tangible research where we can really push the limit of the science we do in robotics. Great way to stay up to date with the published article is checking out the released monthly issue. All the links will be included in each episode description. We will also happen to have a regular conversation on the most published science robotic articles, where also you can contribute with your question and thoughts about the research. Thanks Science Robotics for sponsoring Soft Robotics Podcast. So maybe I would like to ask you first, I would like to define who you are.
Okay, I'm Brad Nelson. I'm the Professor of Robotics and Intelligent Systems at ETH Zurich, also known as the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology here in Zurich on a nice snowy day. I've been here about 19 years, so I direct the multi-scale robotics lab here.
So I'm curious about your work, since you work in the microrobotics scale, and I'm really obsessed with how nature already figured out the solution. And when I see your talks talk about how the whole solution already exists when we try to come up with engineering or solution, I'm curious to ask you in this journey, what kind of maybe lesson still you can't really understand in this scale, how they work, or something still fascinating besides, of course, your work, we'll dive in that. But what could be the major lessons or something still you can understand about how nature already figured out these designs?
Well, evolution is the most powerful force that I know of, it comes from things that the Darwinian evolution, I guess. There's a lot of ways to look at it, but I mean, basically, it's things that work survive, things that work and procreate continue and survive, and if you evolve or develop some advantage, then that gets reinforced. And at the micro scale with microorganisms, what's particularly interesting to me is how microorganisms have evolved locomotion strategies. They've evolved ways of moving that are very foreign to my intuition, because at small scales the physics that predominates is different. But what's particularly interesting to me is just the big motivator is to get away from Fick's law, the constraints of diffusion, and so if you can move, then you can avoid bad things. You can go towards good things. So you don't have to wait around for hours. And hours just to move a centimeter or so, and so there's some really basic physics that has driven a lot of the things that I find interesting at the micro scale, particularly in terms of locomotion. But it's all about it's not survival of the fittest, but these kinds of ideas that. Things that work better tend to stick around longer, right?
So I think the design is very interesting, how the design process goes, but I'm curious to ask you the integration of the material part and structure. And when you show the example, this kind of bacteria inside the robots, for example, or bacteria itself, they don't have neurons and still exhibit intelligence through the movement. So if you can break down how this kind of, the integration, or how this kind of morphology and structure can work together even without having brain. What can be beautiful here about the structure? So maybe something, if you can tell us, in that scale, how you come up with this structure, maybe an evolution in the lab. Yeah.
Well, bacteria are fascinating. I think Howard Berg calls them nature's microrobot. Like you're right, there's not a single neuron in there. But when you study them, you realize that the kinds of behavior they exhibit, it looks to be intelligent in some way. And of course, how you define that, how to define intelligence is a big question. But But if you look at the membrane of a bacteria, it has chemoreceptors on there. It can sense the presence of particularly various chemicals. A lot of times they're amino acids. And that then, when there's a sufficient signal that from those, then that will have an influence in the cytoplasm inside. And then there are pathways just through the cytoplasm of the bacteria that has a small effect on the motors. These are for flagellated bacteria like E. coli, and so it's got sensors on the membrane. It's got the actuator on the one end, or several of them. Sometimes has several flagella. And those rotary motors, those 45 nanometer motors, are affected by what the chemoreceptors are sensing. And if they sense something good, the motors tend to run a little bit longer than they would normally before they kind of reverse and it goes into a random tumbling. So that's when you study that control mechanism. I think it's fascinating because it's something I would never intuit. It's completely not my intuition that, sensor's good, just let the motor run a little bit longer before it starts to go into a random phase again. But it makes a lot of sense when you start to do the physics, when you start to look at diffusion, how long it takes molecules to diffuse, for instance, a micron versus a centimeter. So that kind of behavior where it can actually go towards sources of food, kind of a plume following strategy, which larger robots people have developed. But when it is able to go towards that, I think that shows some intelligence. The other thing is interesting that inside of the cytoplasm are these little plasmids floating around, these chunks of DNA floating around, and that's basically the software. That's coding of course, the proteins that the bacteria, the microorganism needs to function and later to divide. And so I think it's so. Like you said, like you can look at also a paramecium, with all these cilia on them that move in these kind of metachronal wave patterns that cause it to move towards, towards a source of food or something it needs, some kind of chemical it needs. These things have various ways of sensing their environments and then making sure they're moving to places where life's getting better.
I like when you said about the intuition, they come up with the design maybe not aligned with how you envisioned should be. So how do you see the design itself, the structure? Do you think sometimes you have to, if we don't look to how the example you mentioned, the bacteria or the motors here, this scale, there's any kind of designs you come up with based on your intuition, not exactly maybe listen or maybe inspiration from evolution? I don't know if you have come up with design based on your intuition without using, look into evolution. Any moments use intuition only?
Well, so how do you do design? I mean, that's the first thing, I guess. I'm an engineer. This is what you do, right? You look around the world. You see what other people have designed. You iterate off of that. If you don't know where to start, you look at nature and see how's nature solve some of these problems. What can I learn? What's interesting to me is then to dig deeper into the physics of why particular designs that have evolved work, and sometimes it's not clear why those things happen. So I think, but one of the advantages we have that nature doesn't have is we don't have to, when through evolution, you have to you iterate off of where you are. We don't have to iterate. We can bring in whole new ideas from outside, and that's one of the things we do with magnetics, where we can generate complicated magnetic fields and magnetic field gradients to create interesting motions that simply aren't going to evolve in nature because they don't. The fields are weak, and there's just a few examples of microorganisms that actually use magnetic fields in interesting ways. But and we're starting to learn more and more about animals, and it seems like every year there's a new paper, a new understanding of how the organisms are sensing magnetic fields, and so the birds can migrate properly and things like that. So.
And through these years, I don't know if you have maybe any question you think is still not really answered, or maybe harder question, especially in soft robotics field. As you work in microrobotics, soft microrobotics, do you think maybe there's harder question or challenging question, maybe still not?
A challenging question nobody's been able to solve.
Or maybe not ask it, maybe.
Well, I mean, I think one of the most interesting questions I posed to my group for years, and I still haven't figured it out, is how can we make devices that actually grow? I don't mean expand, like a balloon, but I mean grow where they actually take material from their environment and add to themselves and create structures that can move. I work with a molecular biologist who studies plants. One of the things we work on are pollen tubes. You take like a grain of pollen from, for instance, a lily, and under the right conditions, then a pollen tube starts growing out of that, and it grows at several microns a minute. It's like the fastest growing cell in the world, my friend Uli Grosniklaus I work with says, and I believe him. I don't know of anything faster. But somehow that pollen tube is growing. The tip is dissolving and reforming, and it's moving. It's what it's looking for is a female part of the plant, so then it can release the DNA it's carrying inside of it to fertilize the plant or the seed to create the seeds for the next generation. And we've thought a long time about how we might make something grow. And I still don't feel like we have a good solution yet. So I would like to see, there are some other folks out there thinking about it. A lot of it is based on crystals, crystallization processes, and things like that, which are interesting, but not quite what I have in mind, but still.
Yeah, I'm curious to ask you on the growing part. Do you think it's about material features, functionality, or structures? Can you break it down more realistically?
Yeah, well, I think it's complicated. I mean, we don't really understand a lot of the details of how this, just going back to the pollen tube, how does that thing, what's going on with the structure? We can sense some of the mechanics, and we know at the tip it's softer, and somehow it can be, it's somehow dissolving and reforming with material that's inside the cytoplasm of the cell. But it's complicated, and there's many steps to it. It's not like, you're just building a brick wall and you put this and this. There's several intermediate steps that have to be going on in that, and I think the complexity it's interesting.
Mm-hmm. Do you think I don't know if you imply about self-replication in that case also? Besides growing?
Well, yeah, I mean, so that's another thing. We'd like to, build self-replicating robots. I don't know, maybe we get into a Fantasia problem, but devices that can self-replicate. But that's, I think, growing is maybe a little bit easier problem to start with. So that was the challenge that we talk about every so often. We talk about that, and we try to think if there's some new ideas that we might bring to bear on it. But so we haven't abandoned it, but it's a problem that we haven't figured out. And then self-replication is something that I haven't. I think we've all got fixated now on 3D printing and things like that, which give us some interesting possibilities there, I think.
How you can in the design process, because I think the way you approach design sometimes there's positive features, like get rid of nonlinearities, for example. And in some episode we speak about how nonlinearities could be advantageous, or some features or functionalities, maybe features not positive, like that we have to get rid of that saying. But it turns out to be very interesting.
I mean, so I'm at a university, I'm at a research institute, so we think of kind of far out problems, maybe that don't have immediate practical value, right? They're going to how do you make a microrobot? I mean, that's what we started thinking about in 2003. We was like, how could I make a small intelligent machine that does something interesting? Was under no illusions that it was going to be easy to do it. But I knew, the thing that I knew is as we tried to design it and as we looked at ways we can power it, ways we fabricate it, that a lot of other interesting things are going to come out of the problem, right? I think. So I'm not sure if this is what you're getting at or not, but making a microrobot move. So, when we first started thinking about it, we thought, well, how would we do that? Well, you thought about a lot of different things, but we realized, using magnetic fields and magnetic field gradients and having a small magnetic material then in our robot made a lot of sense for a lot of reasons. Biocompatibility, we know that magnetic fields are generally safe for the human body. They are relatively long distance forces, strong forces. So we selected that problem and went down that path in very, very, very strongly. But along the way, we learned a lot. We've learned a lot, and we still have a lot more to learn about how to generate fields and field gradients. And we also realized there were some other applications that were pretty interesting. For instance, instead of guiding microrobots, well, we could guide small magnetic catheters and endoscopes that have magnetic tips, and so that came out of it. I didn't start thinking, I want to make magnetically guided catheters. I thought I want to solve a big problem. I want to solve how to make a microrobot move. But I realized things come out of that, right? And we get interesting designs for things we didn't really consider and think about, and so that's sent us down this path of it's companies that have spun out, patents that we've created that we never thought of in the beginning. Another good example, when I first started thinking about microrobotics, when I was in 1995, when I built my first lab as an assistant professor, and we were looking at microassembly and micromanipulation, not making small intelligent devices, but just doing basically robotics under microscopes with big things. And I remember in 1998, I saw, I think it was, a Japanese researcher. I can't think of his name. But he had made these little chopsticks, and he's kind of with piezo actuator, really interesting. And he showed a biological cell that he could actually pick up an individual cell, and I thought, oh, that's pretty cool. I think I want to try to understand how we can manipulate individual cells. So we started looking, and one of the first things I want to do is I want to know what kind of forces I'm exerting, so I don't, damage the cell. I want to, understand that. So I tried to, went online, looked all over for force sensors that we could use to measure forces, and couldn't find anything. Nothing on the market that was interesting. There was one company that made a cantilever but it wasn't really usable. So we decided in 1998, we're going to build our own force sensor to measure forces at those scales, just simply so we can handle cells. We weren't sure what we were doing. We were looking at making transgenic organisms, so we would inject DNA into oocytes, into the nucleus of an oocyte, but we needed to know the forces on that. So we spent 4 years trying to figure out, this is with Yu Sun, who's at the University of Toronto, when he was a PhD student with me. He spent 4 years trying to figure out how to build this force sensor. And then in that time, I moved from Illinois to Minnesota, then to ETH here in Switzerland. And what happened was, as we were getting this force sensor and then really working, and every time I would give a talk or I'd show us using it, somebody would come up to me and say, "Oh, can we get some of those force? Can we? Do you sell them? Do we have those? And can I use them?" And I'm like, "Well, we don't." But I had a couple students here at ETH, and they were interested in the company. I said, "Well, I know there's a market because people keep asking if they can buy it. I don't know how big it is." But there's an example. That's a company that was founded in 2007 called Femtotools. It's got about 25 employees now. And it's still based on that, the fundamental component is that force sensor that we made because we wanted to sense individual forces on cells. Now, that's not their market. That's not where they're selling all their devices. They're into nano indentation these days. That's where their real strength is, and whole systems for that. But it's still that force sensor, which we designed for a completely different application, and then all of a sudden we found, hey, there's actually there's a gap in the market and there's a need, and so it's filling that need, and companies they've done a good job in marketing, getting it out there. So design's interesting. I think as researchers, as engineering researchers, we pick interesting problems without a real clear initial market pull or what it's going to be. We just find them challenging problems, and then along the way, as you do all the design to try to solve parts of that, then you see things that you see applications and you realize things you didn't know. And I think that's one of the challenges of building a research group, is trying to strategize and choose good problems. And I think, as a professor, that's one of my main tasks here, is to make sure we're working on good problems and we have a strategy. So.
And I'm curious to ask you, when you go to the small scale, exhibiting intelligence on a smaller scale, maybe what's the challenging here? You already mentioned that many times, but the challenge of scaling down and having this intelligent behavior, should you count more in the structure or the material, because you're already using biocompatible polymers, but I don't know what kind of maybe component is so significant in the design, the structure and the scale. What's really significant to you?
Well, I think as soon as I started working in microrobotics and started thinking about how to make small things, I realized the importance of materials. And I spent a lot of time when I first started back in '95, started going down this path. I spent a lot of time learning how to do microfabrication, how to make MEMS. I went and did workshops and courses on how to make small things. I was never that, as a bachelor, master, PhD student, I was never really that interested in materials and chemistry. I liked more the physics side, more physics and math, and less chemistry and materials. But I realized as I worked in this area that materials were absolutely key, and we needed to go much deeper on the materials side, because you need, if you're going to make something move with magnets, you need good magnetic properties. If you want to do it in the body, it needs to be biocompatible, preferably biodegradable. So if you lose it, it's not going to hurt anybody. It's just going to kind of disappear after a while. If you're going to put it in the body, you want to maybe see it, so you got to put some kind of a contrast agent on it so that you can see it with X-rays or with ultrasound or something like that. But trying to bring all these material properties together is a huge challenge. I was lucky when I moved to Switzerland. There was a guy in Barcelona who had read some of our papers we published at Minnesota on magnetic electroplating with composite materials, and he all of a sudden discovered I was here, and so he's a PhD student. He says, I'd like to come and spend some time. So he got some funding and came up and did a lot of his PhD here. There's a guy by the name of Salvador Pani. And then he said, I'd like to come back for a postdoc. And so he found some money and was to support himself and came back here. And he's been here a long time now. He's a professor just right down the hall from me. And he's a chemist, a physical chemist. His specialty is electrochemistry, electroplating particularly. And so that was quite a nice combination, because now I've got a person really trained in materials and chemistry that I can work. We work directly, and then I can do the focus on more of the robotics, physics, control side that I enjoy. And so I think, as you go small scale, micro and nano, it's materials, and then when you look at the applications, then we start getting into more biology, we get into medicine, and so then you need to team up with those people. But to me, there's still fundamental robotics problems. They're still about making small, intelligent things.
Mm-hmm. What could be missing feature and functionality so far in the soft micro robotics? You say, this is really, I can't get this functionality or this feature. Maybe a trade-off, you can't really avoid this kind of the design. There's something here in this still missing for you, the feature, functionality, or a trade-off you can't avoid.
Well, I mean, so what are these things going to do? I mean, the first thing you think is delivering a drug somewhere or some kind of a targeted therapy. And so, they're small. Well, that means they can't carry a big payload, right? So but the idea is you don't need to carry a big payload, because if you're going to find the source of the disease, maybe you can just put smaller amounts of more powerful therapeutics on it. But you also, the other thing you can do is, of course, create swarms of these. You can have hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, millions of these things that are all working together in this small little area. So, so it's just, that's a challenge. But, there's other functions for these things too, ablating tissue, and so then, again, you come to the challenge, well, these are small, so how much energy can they carry? How can you transduce that energy or from other sources? And that's one of the things with Salvador Pane that he's quite interested in our multi-Furlock materials. These are materials that can transform different types of energy. So you take a material and expose it to a magnetic field, and it can create a small electric charge around it, or stress it, maybe with ultrasound with some kind of pressure waves, and then it can also create that, and light as well. So you can transform between different kinds of energy, and so those are all materials issues. You always wish they were better. You wish you had higher saturation magnetic materials, and you wish they were biodegradable. But there's just some things that you just got to live with and figure out ways around, and so there's. That's just the challenge. But again, a lot of it comes back to materials, but a lot of it comes back to the physics as well too, because unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know how the world would be different, but magnetic fields drop off with a cube of distance, so they do drop off rapidly. So that means you're going to need to pump a lot of energy to create magnetic fields over distances.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Maybe I'm curious to ask you about the redundancy of that case. Do you think how you make sure, since there are you mentioned magnetic field, for example, how it's really crucial here. But there's kind of redundancy, and make sure this micro robot is just doing the exact thing every time. I don't know if there's a scenario like emergent behavior happening. I don't know. I'm curious, or maybe failure, and they can't have this kind of redundancy to achieve the goal. How do you make sure this happens?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's, again, coming back to swarms, where you've got a lot of things, right? And that's the way, nature is. I mean, not every... insect is successful, but when you get enough of them, they, then together they keep the species going, right? And I mean, similarly with these devices, is you have a lot of them. They don't all have to get there and do their job, but enough of them do. And so I think there's some interesting ways we need, rethink robotics. It's not like we've got a robot has to achieve its task every time. But if we have a bunch of these little devices and enough of them are successful, then that's hopefully good enough. And so, and again, you borrow lessons from nature and how nature has considers these problems, how they've developed solutions that seem to work.
Mm-hmm. And do you envision for magnetic field? Do you envision maybe in the future, I don't know, other ways to empower these tiny robots in that case, beyond magnetic field?
Yeah, I mean, there's several different ways we could do it as well. Some folks working on ultrasound, Daniel Ahmed here at ETH, who was in my lab now, he's a professor here as well. He's been focusing a lot on ultrasound and using these pressure waves to energize things. Folks have looked at catalytic approaches where chemicals, some of these, use like hydrogen peroxide, which is an interesting research topic, but it's not going to work in the body. But then there's other, in acidic environments, kind of acids where you get some kind of chemical approach. And then a number of people have been looking at light sensitive materials that, you maybe shine a little laser, a little light on it, and it can gather. They use that energy, transform it. So there's light, there's chemicals, there's ultrasound, there's magnetic fields. I think those are the main ones. I don't think I'm leaving anything big out there.
Great. So since it goes to the end, I maybe have a few questions for you. I don't know what you see the next thing in tough robotics. Maybe you mentioned growing in the beginning, growing robots, but what are the next thing do you think? Or maybe missing tools?
Well, I mean, one of the things that's been interesting is 4D printing, I think, where, we print something in 3D or 2D, and then after it's printed, it changes its shape and it can morph into different sizes. I think that's an interesting research problem. I still, people are trying to build nice soft motors, actuators, it always at the end comes down to powering these things. I always tell my students, if you really want to change the field of robotics, build a better battery. Same thing for soft robotics. Better energy storage is going to help drive that field more. But I think there's just fundamental problems because these are these materials that are being used have they're soft, they're flexible, and they're difficult to model. It's much easier to model a rigid structure, obviously, and so there's still a lot of fundamental issues on how do you instrument them, sense how do you deliver energy, and so what's I'm not sure what. So those are fundamental research issues.
I'm curious if there's maybe any surprising moment, because you mentioned at the beginning, sometimes you design something and you try to explain the physics behind it. And sometimes it's quite rich, where you have a simple design, but it's really have explanation for physics quite maybe complex or rich. I don't know for you, that design, you came up with a design and the physics was kind of surprising or rich, or maybe in the design itself, the behavior was surprising, both side in physics or the design.
Well, one of the things we worked on starting probably around 2005, 2006 was on this concept of what we call an artificial bacteria flagella. And the way that started was, again, going back to just micro manipulation. We'd run into a group not too far from here in Switzerland, not here at ETH, but at the Paul Scher Institute, one of the government labs. And they had been working with a professor at Basel and had developed these helical spring-like structures that were, with nanometer thin ribbons. And, we had this ability to manipulate things, these micro manipulators and all. And we thought, those are pretty interesting. Maybe we can get some of those and we could just, do some tests on them. And so there was a PhD student by the name of Li Zhang who was there and so we started working with Lee and his Grutzmacher and some of the folks there, and we realized, we could make little machines, maybe little springs, maybe a little goniometer, some kind of a device, and then I'm not sure who, but somebody says, those things look, they're similar in size to bacteria, these helical flagella that things like E. coli or Salmonella have. And so we kind of got a crazy idea to say, can we get these things to rotate and see how they would move in a liquid, in water? And we were looking, well, how do the real bacteria move? Oh, they got this rotary motor. We studied that, and then okay, we're not going to be able to make the rotary motor, but what if we put a little bit of magnetic material on the end of it and we just rotated a field? Maybe we could get it to start moving and spinning. So we did that. And we gave it to a couple of master students, a Swiss and a Swedish student studying here, just to see, maybe we can do something. And lo and behold, they were able to get this thing to actually propel it in liquid, which kind of surprised us. We thought we didn't know that it was going to work, and so we started looking further and further into the physics of it, and we realized how lucky we had gotten that we were able to move, because there were a lot of things we didn't understand. And then as we studied the hydrodynamics and even the magnetization of it, we were lucky that we were using low fields. If we'd been using higher fields, it never would have worked. But we were using low millitesla level fields. And so, we kind of got lucky to get that thing to move. And we published in 2007 at ICRA, we published a paper on it. And then we published in 2009 was an applied physics letter paper, APL. And but we started looking at the hydrodynamics, the magnetics, the stability, all that physics, and it just got more and more fascinating. And then when you realize how the story comes together, you've got you've got the inspiration from biology, right? And then we have magnetism. We bring in a whole other thing from another area, and then we have the nanofabrication. The technology we were using at the time was based on self-scrolling thin films. And it came together in kind of a beautiful way that was, I think, really intellectually very satisfying to see that happen. And then, we continued to publish papers now, and then direct laser writing became commercially available with the nanoscribe, and we were lucky to get one of those first systems and realized we could now, instead of doing all the self-scrolling processes which use nasty non-biocompatible materials, and they were difficult to work with, and all of a sudden we could make these out of polymers and do direct laser writing. That opened up a whole new avenue for us. So you kind of just keep going down, and you start seeing these things. And now Xiaopu Wang, she's at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Shenzhen, and the AI robotics institute there in Shenzhen. And we've been working with her a lot now as she set up her lab, moved from here out to there on materials that are biodegradable, that we can pattern with lasers, and so it's quite we just keep studying it. We keep going down there. We keep discovering new things. We worked on different surface energies, different hydrophobic, hydrophilic, and trying to understand how that influenced its behavior. So there's we've been thinking about this for well over a decade now. In fact, probably 15 years of just this one little device. But it's still interesting. There's still things that we find are worth spending a little time on and publishing.
Wonderful. Yeah, 3 questions left. The first one, I don't know if you have moment of maybe doubt or maybe harsh failure, because sometimes to open yourself for real success, sometimes we have to go through real failure. I don't know if you have moment in that.
Oh, we have a lot of failures. That's I have a big group here, so we got a lot of things going on, a lot of different projects. So if we, for the student, the researcher who hits a brick wall on something, that's not fun. But but we've always got new ideas and new things coming out. But one thing I guess I could consider a failure is this growing stuff. I've never figured it. We haven't come up with a good solution that I find compelling yet, and we keep thinking about it. And then we've tried to spin off of some technologies that hasn't been as successful as we thought. We've ran into some roadblocks there. They weren't really research roadblocks. They were more, business kind of roadblocks. But those were probably the worst failures, because they're, it's clear, in research, if something doesn't work, well, you ask the question a little differently. You look somewhere and you try to find something interesting in it. So I think, there's, research, a lot of things don't work the way we think they will, but, usually there's something interesting to keep going on.
So I find it's very interesting that you have the both side, entrepreneurship and also being academia. But I'm curious what at the moment for you make you more satisfied and fulfilled as a researcher, or be as a human, what you do make you satisfied and fulfilled?
Well, the funnest, the most fun is sitting in a group of people, sitting with some biologists and a chemist and some engineers, and you start, coming up with ideas, and and then they got the biologists explaining to you how these pollen tubes are working, and then I've got the chemists who they have an insight into what's the real chemistry going on inside of there, and then we're trying to think of the mechanics of the shell of the pollen tube or whatever, and and all the time I'm sitting there with my engineering hat on, thinking, how can I make this? How can I make something, or what lessons can I learn from that? And that's, of course, the most fun, right? That's intellectually satisfying when these ideas come together. But as you get further along in your career, you start to realize, we published a lot of papers. I've put a lot of that work out there. What I'd really love to do is try to make this, not just publish papers, but actually benefit society, get this out there. And so that was the first company was Femtotools, I mentioned, the force sensor, and that got out there, and we saw a need for it. And then we've done some biomedical companies. We're trying to get into the biomedical space, and that was one of the most satisfying moments of my career, was sitting in the hospital watching the electrophysiologist, the surgeon, doing a heart procedure on a woman suffering from a heart arrhythmia, and knowing that that catheter that's in her heart while she's awake, in her beating heart, that whole concept of how we can guide that magnetically, and the whole system that she was in came from, the original idea was from our lab, the patents we filed, and then being able to bring that all the way through. And I mean, that is unbelievably satisfying to realize that you've, there's a ton of people, along the way to make this happen, but to see that, the original ideas came out of here and then turned into a product that actually can, improve a person's health. It felt like a pretty big deal when it was going on.
That's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Last question is, I don't know if you received advice with the life changing, maybe in the career or in life, and it stick to your mind always, advice.
I didn't think a lot about building, my career when I was younger, when I was in my 20s, I should say. I just made sure whatever I was working on, I was excited about and passionate about. And then, I got in the middle of my PhD, and I all of a sudden realized, well, I've got some interesting experience here. I've been able to do some really interesting things. So I think, my advice, and I tell this to my students too, is when you're thinking about what you want to do in your life, or what paths you want to go down, and what kind of job perhaps you want to take, is first of all, do something you're excited about, that you look forward to getting up and doing every day. Now, of course, that doesn't mean it's every day's great, right? We all have bad days, and there's all days where I don't want to go in and write this paper or give this stupid talk or whatever, but make sure that what you're doing excites you. I think that's one. The second, I think, that's important when you choose something, is do something you would feel good about, right? That you feel like you're really making a contribution to society. It doesn't mean you have to be curing cancer, but it means you're doing something that you're proud of, and that you realize this is a contribution, so you can feel good about it. And then the third thing is always, make sure there's, opportunities to grow in what you're doing, that this isn't going to be a dead end for you. This is a field that's, maybe going to disappear overnight or something, think that. So I think, having a passion for what you're doing, at least excited about it in some way, feeling good about what you're doing, having being proud of what it is you're working on, and then realizing that, looking at what opportunities it's going to give you in the future, considering those three things, you can't go wrong, I think. So
that's really valuable. I don't know if you have any final words you'd like to say for the robotics community. Any final words you'd like to say?
Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you and thinking about all these things. I think Robotics is something I accidentally fell into in 1984, long, long time ago. I didn't intend to go down the field, but it was a good it was a good mistake. I guess I shouldn't say I call it a mistake, but a good happenstance that I ended up in it. And I'm more excited about robotics than ever. And I've been in the field now for over 35 years, and I think it's a fun field. It's a field where you need to be a bit of a philosopher and ask yourself questions about the nature of intelligence and things. But it's also a field where you get to play with technology, which is always fun. And I think it's been a great ride to be in this field, and I'm excited to see where it's going to go in the next coming decades. So that's.
Thanks so much, Brad. I think it was very inspiring. Touch on have you again on the podcast. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Take care.